Tale Podcast: How Stories Shape and Change Our Lives.
Thank you once again for joining me on this third installment of our 6-part introductory series on learning how to engage with stories in deep and meaningful ways. If you're just tuning in for the first time, I wish to extend my welcome to you, and I encourage you to go back and listen to the first 2 episodes of this series as well. In the last decade or so, scientists have made a very interesting and peculiar discovery about our Earth. And that is that our Earth has its very own hum, which is a constant pulsing note that's too low in frequency to be heard by human ears. The hum of the Earth is due to a phenomenon called microseisms, which are low-frequency, long-period seismic waves that reverberate continuously throughout the planet's crust. Some scientists speculating that these waves could very well penetrate all the way to the Earth's core. When I think about an idea like that in mythological terms, it invokes for me the phenomenon and the magic of music, and how music itself may be what shapes and holds all things together in the universe, including its matter. There's an old Latin word, humus, H-U-M-U-S, which directly translated means of the ground or of the earth. And in that word humus or humus, I see the word hum. And again, the thought that music and matter may be in essence the same thing provokes a sense of numinous awe within me. Now that word numinous, it invokes the idea of divinity. And divinity means different things to different people, but in the language of myth, the word divinity or divine just simply refers to that which is eternal or timeless, that which is without time, that which just is. And when people talk about having experiences of numinous awe, they almost always speak of them as being a humbling experience. And it's interesting to see here how the words humble and humility also derive from that same Latin root word, humus. To be humble or to practice humility then means simply to be grounded or rooted in the earth. And to be rooted, psychologically speaking, means to be grounded in oneself, authentically and honestly. In other words, to be humble is to simply have an ability to tell the truth about yourself and also to speak and act from a place of truth. And we can see how, as we approach our own stories, as well as the stories of fairy tale and myth, that our ability to practice getting into the humus of things is extremely crucial to our being able to encounter the deep and abiding symbols, metaphors, and images that want to speak to us most powerfully in engaging with those kinds of stories. So this idea of humbleness and humility is being rooted in this grounding of the humus really stands in stark contrast with how our modern culture has interpreted and used those words. When we hear those words, or are worse, scolded by them, we hear them as words more of admonishment. Who of us, after all, hasn't heard some version of "don't toot your own horn" at some point in our lives, being instructed instead to keep ourselves quiet, small, hidden, diminutive, unobtrusive? We can see from this point of view how easy it would be for our own shame stories to not only get triggered, but also collude with these ideas. We use the term humiliation, after all, as a way to describe the experience of being stripped of our own sense of self-worth or dignity. So our culture, it seems, has confused and conflated the idea of humbleness with instead self-effacement. And many of us, I believe, have learned how to adopt and practice self-effacement as a virtue in an effort to avoid appearing or being accused of thinking too highly of ourselves. Some of us are working perhaps a little too hard to practice a diminutive image of ourselves with others, almost as a matter of pride, ironically. What if, instead of following our dominant culture's lead here, we were able to accept and respond through the true spirit of the humus itself? What implications would that have for us as we get more curious about ourselves and more curious about our own stories? So again, I would like to propose that to be humble simply means to tell the truth about yourself. But let's dig a little deeper and explore what that actually implies. I'll use a story here, and I'm going to utilize the tool of hyperbole, as fairy tales often do, to emphasize the point or the moral of the story. So as a kid, I grew up in the Michael Jordan Chicago Bulls era, and living as close as I did to Chicago, it was impossible not to be aware of or even a little swept up in the hype of it all. And in that period of time, there were a lot of people that were proclaiming that Michael Jordan was the best basketball player in the world. Now let's assume for a moment that we can or could have established that as a point of fact. That would mean that Michael Jordan, in that period of time in his life and in his career, could have stated in all humility that he himself was the best basketball player in the world because he would be telling the truth about himself. So let's pause here for a second to allow our rattle brains to slow down a bit as we're trying to process this example. I'll bet it has never occurred to most of you that thinking highly or well of yourself, much less expressing that openly and honestly, could be an act of humility or humbleness. Our cultural projections have taught us how to conflate the ideas of thinking well of oneself as a form of arrogance. So let's take a closer look at that word, arrogance. The act of arrogance itself essentially means to arrogate myself over someone else. So let's return briefly to our Michael Jordan example. If Michael Jordan were to take an extra step and say, because I'm the best basketball player in the world, that makes me a better or more valuable human being than you, now Michael Jordan has committed an act of arrogance. Now he is arrogating himself over other people. To be clear, there is such a thing as thinking too highly of oneself. We call that hubris, and hubris is either a willful or ignorant miscalculation of the truth about me as being more capable of something than I actually am or of higher value than other people. But on the other side of that ledger, thinking too low or too poorly of oneself and one's abilities is also a miscalculation of the truth and is itself a form of false humility. In both examples, I am not telling the truth about myself. I used to do this all the time when I was younger and still trying to find my own identity and sense of self-worth. Anytime someone would give me a compliment about something that I did or said, no matter how big or small, my automatic response is to begin arguing with them and deconstructing their argument by pointing out all the mistakes that I had in fact made, or all the different ways I had in fact fallen short in my efforts or missed something somehow, in essence diminishing the value and impact of whatever it was I was receiving the compliment for. I believed that I was being humble, but in fact I was practicing false humility. Not because I intended to. I very much believed again in my own poor assessment of myself. I wasn't able to see, at least at that time, the fuller truth of my own capabilities and value as a human being. You know, it's one thing to misjudge or miscalculate our own strengths and abilities in terms of hubris or self-degradation. It's another thing entirely to misjudge our own sense of value as being either more than or less than others. In this sense, true humility always points us back to the reality of our own inherent worth as human beings simply by virtue of being human. Since these are experiences I think are familiar to all of us or we can relate to in some way, it begs the question of a journey. And I believe one of the primary aspects of a journey back into humility or back into the humus, which, by the way, requires a tremendous amount of self-awareness on our part, is in fact a journey of innocence into awareness or consciousness. We're learning more of the truth about who we actually are. And in so doing, it's also a journey of learning how to shed old stories of ourselves that we can see are no longer true or were never true to begin with. A journey back into the humus is a journey back of remembering an essential truth about ourselves. Again, the truth of our own inherent wholeness. The true journey of the heroine, the hero, the protagonist is a journey of rediscovering the realities of who they already are, what they already have, and what they are already capable of, even if they didn't know it before. And in this sense, the point of the journey is the journey itself. Humility is not something to be achieved. It is a way of life to be lived, to be chosen in each moment. In this sense, the journey does not presuppose a destination where we finally and forever get it right. It is, in fact, more accurate to say that it is a journey of learning how to get better at getting it wrong over and over again, because it is in our mistakes that are revealed to us some of the greatest gifts of wisdom we can ever receive. Like curiosity, humbleness is an orientation towards ourselves and our stories that allows us to see them accurately, but in so doing also allows our stories to continue to grow as well as heal, and also to connect and understand that we are engaged in this as a lifelong process or practice. There will never be a time when we run out of things to learn about ourselves. We can choose to stop, and many of us do, but that does not mean that those parts or stories that lay hidden from us simply go away. They do not. And if we shut ourselves off from them for too long, they will find more creative and disruptive ways of disturbing us to get our attention. We need to know what makes such a journey worthwhile for us, because learning how to tell the truth about ourselves is not an easy task. It takes time and a commitment to ourselves. We have to be aware of those things that we stand to lose or must let go of that we don't want to or we're not ready to let go of just yet as we are making a journey into the next phase of our lives. Taking a journey back into our own wholeness, also we need to remember, it doesn't provide us with a life free of pain or difficulty. What it does is it gives us some gifts and some lenses to look through to be able to interpret ourselves differently and in a more healing and holistic way when we do encounter life's wounds and difficulties. What we are asking of ourselves is to open us up to more of our own vulnerability, as well as whatever wounds are sitting in those vulnerable places. And all of us have developed many different effective barriers, walls, and other forms of protective layers between ourselves and those wounds. So we can't kid ourselves and pretend that there isn't a lot at stake for us in learning how to tell more of the truth about ourselves. The death of a false story about us is no less devastating just because it's not true. And we must have the capacity to be able to give ourselves permission to grieve the loss of it. And whatever things we have been holding on to that we cannot bring with us into the next chapter of our lives where we do discover the truer, more authentic stories of ourselves waiting to be born, waiting to be accepted and embraced, and ultimately to be lived more fully. At some point, our false stories about us fail, as false stories always must. And more often than not, it's really only in the aftermath of being broken open or broken apart by anything and everything that can happen to us in a lifetime that we finally consent to take that journey of reclaiming ourselves. Cruel fates have perhaps left us with no other choice. It's an unhappy way to begin a journey back into the soul, and yet it's probably the most common initiatory journey that most of us end up taking. In death, however, is made room for new life, and this is where our hope begins to come through, and this is where we begin to see the value and in accepting and responding to the journey of the soul. Things that have been tightly locked up and concealed within us have indeed been broken open and spilt and scattered all over the floor when we were broken apart. But at least we can see them now, perhaps maybe for the first time. The seeds of hope that we had collected over time have also been spilt and scattered all over the floor, but there they lay still, ready and waiting for us to gather them up and find a new place to plant them once again. And where is it that we go to plant seeds? In the earth, in the soil, in the ground, in the humus. To be authentic is to acknowledge and accept our journeys of life, death, and rebirth. To be humble is to know ourselves as creatures of motion, creatures of journey, creatures of constant growth. We carry all kinds of different stories about ourselves at different times. Some are helpful, some are painful. Some start out as helpful, but later turn harmful because our lives are different, and so are we. And new stories that are more reflective of who we are now must replace old stories that may have served a purpose at a particular point in our lives, but don't anymore. We must ever learn to be kinder to ourselves as we go through a series of changes and transitions and metamorphoses that are natural and indicative of the flow of life itself. We are creatures who are hardwired to find a sense of purpose and meaning for our lives. We don't tend to think of that in terms of multiple purposes, multiple stories, or even multiple versions of ourselves. We're more or less taught to find that mythical one purpose that we follow and remain loyal to for our entire lives. And if that gets threatened or torn apart or shaken up or destroyed, we are prone to feel like failures. And unfortunately, there will be people in our lives that want to accuse us of being failures. And that can leave us feeling as though we've got nowhere to turn when the pain and the wounds and the trauma of that kind of an experience lay us bare and feeling hopeless. But here's where the hope comes back in. In so many stories, myths, and fairy tales, we find a very common archetypal theme of redemption and renewal. We also see in these stories that many of the characters themselves have a choice as to whether or not they are going to accept or reject such opportunities for redemption and renewal. We cannot escape death, not only the final death of our mortal lives, but the many smaller but no less significant deaths we experience throughout a given lifetime. And yet we have these stories that tell us about new life. Each time we allow ourselves to endure the death of a false story of ourselves, we get the opportunity to replant, to allow new, fuller, more authentic, more whole stories about ourselves to take root and grow. To practice humility is to surrender ourselves to where our lives and our stories want to take us. And our lives always want to bring us back into the fullness of our own inherent wholeness. When we choose to surrender ourselves to powerful images and symbols in any kind of a story we engage with, we allow the story to take us where it wants to go. So when it comes to reading myths and fairy tales, we practice humility when we take the story seriously enough, not just to sit with it over time, but to learn more about where it comes from. The culture, the context, the history, even the geography and the place of where those stories were first being told. And this helps prevent us from unwittingly projecting our own cultural interpretations and biases into the story that may or may not actually be there. Now, there is something to be said for making our own spontaneous connections when we do engage with powerful stories. And this is something that can be both exciting and healing for us as we make these new connections. The only trouble that we need to be aware of here is more likely to come from a place of believing that we own our own interpretations of a story as being the one universally correct and intended interpretation of that story. Worse yet, if we make attempts to project that onto other people. So we can see that engaging with new stories of ourselves is fulfilling. It's exciting and healing and at times awe-inspiring. It is also work, a work that takes a commitment that we choose to sit with the stories we engage with, not one time, but many times over a period of time. And over that period of time, we give ourselves permission to see new things in the story that we didn't see before and make new connections and find new doorways into wisdom that were not open to us the first few hundred times maybe that we read a story. As though the story itself, as a living organism, always has something new to show or teach us, but only when we are ready to see it and to receive it. That is what it means for us to be in relationship with stories. That is what it means for us to be in relationship with ourselves. In the next episode, we're going to explore a little deeper this idea of both parts of the human psyche and stories of the human psyche, and how the powerful interchange or exchange between them is what fuels our lives in many different ways. So, once again, I invite you to come along into the next chapter of my introductory series. Thanks once again for joining me. As always, take good care of yourselves, and I'll look forward to seeing you the next time.